Thomas had never planned to raise a child alone. But when his wife walked out the door 30 years ago, disgusted by the truth he could no longer hide, that he was gay, he didn't argue or beg her to stay. He only turned to the crib in the corner of their rented one-bedroom and made himself a quiet promise: she will never feel abandoned. At the time, Thomas was a public school teacher making $32,000 a year, living in a modest neighborhood in New Jersey. He had no backup plan, no partner to lean on, and certainly no blueprint for how to be a single gay father in the early 90s. But every decision he made from that moment forward, from what brand of cereal he bought to whether or not he turned the heat on during the coldest nights, was calculated with one purpose: to give his daughter Julia a life that felt secure. He clipped coupons and mended clothes, skipped vacations, and said no to dates for decades. Being out wasn't just a risk in his career. It was a threat to his custody, his credibility, his livelihood. So he buried that part of himself and put on a mask. The one that smiled at parent-teacher conferences, that took extra shifts in the summer for dance lessons and braces, that stayed up folding laundry while listening to lullabies through a baby monitor. No one gave him applause for those years. No one knew what they cost. Julia grew up loved. She never missed a meal, a school trip, or a holiday present. On her 16th birthday, he bought her a used car after saving for years. He worked late grading papers so she could go to college without loans. When she graduated, he sat in the back row in a wrinkled shirt because dry cleaning felt like a luxury. But he was proud, more than proud. It wasn't until Julia moved out, got her own job, and started building a life that Thomas finally allowed himself to breathe. He was 61 when he met Luis, a gentleman with a soft voice and kind eyes who worked part-time at the local bookstore. For the first time in his life, Thomas experienced love that wasn't secret or shameful. He didn't introduce Luis as a friend. He held his hand in public. He cooked dinner for two. But even then, he never stopped thinking about Julia. He kept every voicemail she left, every photo she sent. He thought he had raised her with enough compassion to see him, truly see him for who he was. He thought she would understand. He had no idea how wrong he was. If this story touched something in you, follow us for the next part. What happens when the love of a father is questioned, not for what he gave, but for who he is? It began with a phone call that Thomas almost didn't answer. Julia's voice, upbeat but measured, filled the speaker. She was getting married. September, a vineyard just outside of Boston. She spoke quickly, like reading off a press release, already knowing her father would say congratulations before he had the chance to absorb the news. She didn't ask if he could come. She asked if he could pay. Not help, not contribute, pay. The full amount, the venue, the catering, the gown, the florals. Think of it as your gift to me, she said lightly, like she was asking him to pass the salt. Thomas laughed, a short, stunned breath. He explained that he was on a fixed income, still working part-time tutoring to supplement his pension, still living in the same rent-controlled apartment he'd been in for 20 years. Retirement was not even in reach. There was a pause. Then Julia said something that clanged like metal on concrete. "So I guess all your money's going to Luis now?" He didn't respond. Couldn't. That night, Thomas sat alone at his kitchen table, a lukewarm cup of tea between his hands, heart pounding for reasons he couldn't name. He wasn't angry, at least not yet. He was something worse. Confused. Wounded. Shaken by the insinuation that love in his life had somehow canceled out his love for hers. 2 days later, the doorbell rang. Thomas opened it to find Mark, Julia's fiancé, standing with a confident smirk, dressed in designer jeans and wearing a watch Thomas knew cost more than his month's rent. "We just think it's fair if you pay half," Mark said casually. "We're stretched thin right now." Thomas glanced past him, down to the curb, where a brand new Escalade idled, chrome wheels gleaming in the sun. "Fair," he repeated under his breath. He didn't say what he was thinking, that he had never received a single dime of help from anyone in his life, that he hadn't had a new car since 1998. That fair was a word people used when they had never once needed to skip a meal to pay rent. He didn't argue. He simply walked to the door and held it open. Mark left, unbothered. But something inside Thomas had shifted. For years, he had excused small cruelties in the name of family. But this was different. It wasn't just entitlement. It was something colder, a refusal to see him as a human being with limits, with a heart with a right to joy that wasn't conditional on giving, giving, giving. In the following days, the pressure grew. Julia sent texts laced with guilt. "You said you'd always be there for me. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. If you truly loved me, you'd do this." But love wasn't a debit card, and her words no longer sounded like a daughter's. They sounded like a stranger's. The silence didn't last. After Thomas refused to fund the wedding, Julia shifted from disappointment to pressure with surgical precision. It began with veiled comments posts on social media about parents who forget their role, messages left on voicemail about being let down when it matters most. Then came the relatives. A cousin he hadn't heard from in years called to say he should do the right thing. Often an aunt messaged him with a link to a GoFundMe, hinting that it wouldn't be necessary if someone had stepped up. But none of them had raised her. None of them had been there when she had the flu at 6, when she broke her arm falling off her bike, when she cried over a college rejection and he held her hand through it. None of them had wiped her tears or skipped dinners so she wouldn't go without. Yet suddenly they all had opinions about what he owed. And the worst part, Julia didn't stop them. Luis watched it all unfold. Quiet but steady, he made tea when Thomas couldn't sleep, sat next to him when the silence in the apartment felt like it might swallow him whole. One night, as Thomas reread a message from Julia that ended with the words, "You've clearly chosen him over me," Luis said softly, "If you need me to step aside, I will. I don't want to be the reason you lose her." It broke something in Thomas. Not because Luis was wrong, but because it made him realize how much of his life had been about choosing who he was allowed to love. He had spent decades putting others' comfort above his truth. Now the daughter he had given everything to was asking him to do it again. But this time it wasn't just about silence. It was about money, about control, about a version of fatherhood where his sacrifices were invisible unless they came with a price tag. Julia's next move was a gift box. It arrived one morning by courier. Inside, a white envelope, a card that read, "For your peace of mind," and a printed invoice, every itemized cost of the wedding, from the floral arrangements to the DJ, with a handwritten note beside the total. "If you care, you'll help." Thomas stared at it for a long time. Then he walked into his closet, opened the lockbox he kept on the top shelf, and pulled out a small album, 30 pages of photos and notes from Julia's childhood. Some were drawings she made when she was 6. Others were letters she wrote him from camp, sticky with glue and love. He packaged it all together and sent it back. No message, no explanation, just a ribbon and a return label. Julia didn't respond, but Thomas heard from Mark. This time it was a voicemail, sharp and smug. "Guess that tells us everything we need to know." What they didn't know was that it did say everything. That album had been the one thing Thomas kept beside his bed all those years he was alone. The one proof that it had all been worth it. Returning it wasn't spite, it was grief, and yet, beneath the grief, something new was growing. Not resentment, not yet, but clarity. For the first time in years, Thomas saw what he had built, a life where he no longer had to buy love, prove loyalty, or beg to be seen. He didn't know it yet, but the decision to say no wasn't the end of his relationship with Julia. It was the beginning of a new kind of reckoning. The wedding came and went without an invitation. Thomas didn't expect one. Weeks had passed since he returned the album. There had been no calls, no apologies, only a kind of cold vacuum where his daughter's voice used to be. He followed updates through distant cousins and an occasional tagged photo that made its way to his screen. Julia looked radiant. The dress was lavish, the venue extravagant. There were rows of gold-trimmed chairs and a flower arch taller than most trees. Mark, in a custom suit, beamed beside her. And in the front row, seated where Thomas once imagined himself, was a man he'd never met. Mark's stepfather, known for his wealth and less for his warmth. Thomas didn't cry, not when he saw the pictures, not when he read that Julia had walked down the aisle to a string quartet playing her favorite childhood song, not even when he noticed the absence of any mention of her father in the program, where the ingratitude section listed names he didn't recognize. Instead, on the day of the wedding, Thomas woke early, dressed in his oldest blazer, and took the train to the coast. He sat on a bench by the water with Louis, both sipping coffee in silence. There was no sadness in the air, only a kind of quiet respect for the time passing, for the life they had built, and for the fact that even now dignity remained. But it wasn't all peace. That night, as he opened his email, Thomas found a message from a former colleague, someone who had attended the wedding. The message was brief, almost apologetic. "She used your old classroom photos in the slideshow," it read. "I thought you should know." Thomas stared at the screen, a reel of emotions twisted inside him. Not anger, not pride, just the strange ache of being remembered silently after being erased publicly. Luis found him later that evening, still at the computer, fingers resting on the keyboard but unmoving. Thomas finally looked up and whispered, "She wanted the memories, not the man who made them." Luis sat beside him, said nothing, just placed a hand gently on his shoulder. A week passed, then two, and then a letter arrived, not from Julia, but from the law firm that handled Mark's family trust. It was an invitation not to reconnect, but to discuss a clause Julia had inserted post-wedding. A clause suggesting that, should anything happen to her, her father would not be considered next of kin. Thomas didn't attend the meeting. He didn't need to. The message was clear. He had been replaced. And yet, he didn't crumble. He didn't lash out or write letters or call and demand anything. Instead, he placed every photo of Julia back into the album he had returned, every drawing, every birthday card, every crayon-colored picture. Then he did something unexpected. He wrote a check. Not to Julia, not to the wedding, but to a local LGBTQ+ youth shelter that had just opened a new wing for older queer adults who had been displaced by family. He dedicated the donation in her name, not out of spite, but because even when love is rejected, it can still be redefined. The call came on a Wednesday morning, unexpected and sharp. Julia was at her desk, distracted by wedding thank you cards she still hadn't written. When an unfamiliar number lit up her phone, she let it ring. Then again. The third time she answered. The voice was clinical but calm. Her father, Thomas, had been brought to the hospital after collapsing in a local market. A stroke. He was stable for now, but unresponsive. Her first reaction wasn't panic. It was confusion. They hadn't spoken since the wedding. Her last words to him had been cold. She had cut him out not with a single act, but with months of silence, coated in pride and old hurt. But now, with the idea of him lying alone in a hospital bed, something cracked open in her. She drove there without telling anyone. No plan, no expectations, only instinct. At the hospital, the hallways were gray and hushed. Nurses moved without rush. Julia asked for Thomas and was led to a small room with a single window. He was there, pale, eyes closed, machines quietly recording his pulse. For a long time, she just stood in the doorway. He looked older than she remembered. Smaller, more human. When she finally walked in, she didn't speak. She sat beside him and stared at his hand. She remembered the same hand reaching out when she had nightmares, when she fell off her bike, when she walked across the graduation stage. She whispered, barely audible, "Hi, Dad." The days that followed were slow and heavy. She kept coming, each time with something small, a blanket from his apartment, books she remembered he loved, even soup in a thermos he never woke to taste. Luis came too. They didn't speak much, but something unspoken passed between them. Mutual grief, maybe, or a quiet alliance born from loving the same man differently. One afternoon, while Thomas still hadn't opened his eyes, Julia found a locked drawer in his nightstand. The nurse had brought over a small box with his things. Inside was a sealed envelope with her name. She hesitated, then opened it. It was a letter, dated months ago, meant to be given on her wedding day. "I couldn't give you what you asked for," it began, "not because I didn't love you, but because I finally learned to stop proving it through pain. You are still my daughter. But I am also a man who deserves peace, even if it's late. I hope one day you'll understand that." She read it twice, then again. Later that evening, when Thomas finally opened his eyes for the first time, the room was dim. Luis was asleep in the corner. Julia was still sitting beside the bed, holding the letter in one hand. He blinked slowly, focused, then whispered, "You came." She nodded, unable to speak. Recovery was slow but steady. And as Thomas began to speak more, walk again? Remember dates and names, Julia kept coming. They never discussed the wedding or the check or the silence that came after, not directly, but on his birthday she brought him a gift, a photo album. Inside were pictures of the wedding, but not the ones from the professional photographer. These were different, a single shot of an empty seat in the front row, a blurry moment during the father-daughter dance when she had stopped and looked around as if missing something. A note written on the last page. I'm sorry I tried to buy your love with something as small as money. I see now it was already paid for in full. Thomas closed the album, tears gathering but not falling. He reached for her hand. Somewhere in the silence, something finally settled. Not everything needed to be said. Some love is quiet. Some forgiveness doesn't arrive with grand speeches, but with a chair pulled close and time finally spent. Has someone ever loved you in a way you didn't recognize until you almost lost them? Tell us in the comments. And if this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear. It's never too late to return.